Hey folks, Dr. Doug here. Thanks for joining us today. You know, a couple of months ago, I got a call from a friend of mine, and she was really concerned because her son had just been diagnosed with ADHD. And with this pandemic, where everyone is kind of being isolated in their homes, it was really a challenge. And as I thought about that, I thought, you know what, it would be fantastic to talk to some experts on ADHD and how parents can process through that with their children and how their children can get the help that they need. And so today I'm really pleased to have a couple of wonderful ladies with us today, Nancy Williams and Vikki Carrel, and they are with Thorup Counseling. How are you ladies doing today?
We're good.
Thank you. And it's actually Thorup Tutoring Company, because we don't have counselors.
Thorup Tutoring Company. Okay,
yes,
that's
okay.
Good to know. All right, so we'll start. Nancy, with you. Tell us a little bit about your background, and you're the one that actually started it, right?
Right, and then Vikki's the one that wrote the book we're going to talk about today too. But
yes,
yeah,
absolutely.
I started working for a couple of neuropsychologists when I was in my early 20s, and they specialize in ADHD and head injury and learning disabilities. And I got a lot of my training there, but I also just got a lot of experience and learning, having individual students and learning about their struggles that they have and being creative and thinking of ways to help them. And then after 7 years, I brought my business home and they referred to me. And now I've got a building and 25 tutors and a wonderful program here in Holiday, Utah that just, you know, I feel like we're a one-on-one tutoring company that helps children with their individual needs, their individual programs. For one-on-one tutoring, I've hired Vikki as an academic language therapist, an academic coach who's amazing with executive functioning skills. We've got tutors that could tutor any subject, but we really do help kids that struggle in school and help those parents navigate how to help them succeed.
Okay, so it's really helping those kids that are struggling.
Yes.
Okay, great. And Vikki, tell us a little bit about yourself and tell us about your book. By the way, here is the book. It's reversed those, so building blocks. So tell us a little bit about yourself and about why you wrote the book and a little bit about the book.
Thank you. I really appreciate being on the show today, and I love working with Nancy. She runs a fabulous company. She cares so much about each of her students, and the one-on-one is really great. What an academic language therapist does is I deal with kids primarily that have reading disorders and writing disorders. And then what I do is after they've had either a school psychologist diagnose them or a neuropsychologist diagnose them, then it kind of comes to me through Nancy's company. So we work with the school to make sure that accommodations and modifications are in place to support them in the classroom. And then when I work with them weekly, it's about building their learning continuum step by step. Because kids with disabilities and disorders, they miss steps in the learning process depending on what the disorder is. So for kids that have a problem with, say, reading, for them, they've probably struggled with phonological awareness. They may not even know that what blends and that B makes the B sound. So sometimes we have to really back up and kind of start at square one, depending on how old the student is and where they are and how many, combined disorders they have. Sometimes it might be ADHD, dyslexia, dysgraphia, and slow processing. So there's a myriad of different diagnoses that it's like a puzzle, putting a puzzle together, and then working with Nancy with her team, and then also the school team and the parents to try to educate them and make sure that the school has put in place everything we need for that child to succeed. So that's what I do. And I've been doing it for over 15 years. I got started in the East. And then when I moved here, it's kind of a fun story. My parents were friends with Nancy's parents and our moms connected us. So that's how I started working for Nancy. And I've been with her about 9 years.
And you wrote the book, Building Blocks.
I did. I wrote it. I raised 2 boys with learning challenges, ADHD and writing and reading challenges. And I'd wished I'd had something like this when I was told that my children were struggling. It's just a very frightening feeling. You feel so lost. And what is an IEP? What is a modification? And so I did a lot of blog writing for Nancy, and then we collaborated on the book. She supported me a lot with it on how can we write an easy step-by-step book. So it's written in such a fashion that it's not a cover to cover read. You go into the area. So if your child has ADHD, that's the chapter you go to. But it's kind of broken into 3 parts. And so there is definitely that cognitive piece, but there's also a behavioral piece, because so often children that have learning challenges struggle with behavior as well. Low self-esteem, just a myriad of things. So that's what the book is about. It's a quick go-to for parents and educators to understand what the neuropsychologists are saying when they write their evaluations, because they're pretty complex.
I can imagine. And we're going to talk about a lot of things. Prior to us actually getting on the show, Nancy and I were visiting a bit, and I was sharing a story with her about my son. And let me share a story with you. As many people know, I previously had a dental practice for 21 years. And when I was practicing dentistry, one of the areas I really got fascinated with was people who had chronic head and neck pain. And if you go to the dentist and they say, "What's your problem?" "Oh, you have TMJ." Well, people would walk into my office and go, "Oh, I have TMJ." And I'm going, "No, you have 2, one on this side and one on the other side." Now, tell me what your symptoms are. And then we would get in and really figure out what was going on and find the root cause of what was happening. And yet, in general, what I found was, and even today, although I'm retired from that, TMJ is the big thing for many dentists, and everybody diagnoses whatever symptoms are going on as TMJ. So here's my question, and it's not a challenge, but I want your real honest input on this. It seems like all of a sudden we've seen a huge influx of diagnoses of ADHD. Now, I'm not going to get into the other ones because I get the fact that those are real. With ADHD, how many times do you find that it may be an easy diagnosis for a school psychologist to make, because the way that teaching goes on within our standard educational process is such that it does not actually fit the learning style, the cognitive style of many children?
Nancy, you jump in real quick.
Yeah,
Go ahead.
sure.
Well, first of all, school psychologists really don't diagnose ADHD. That's usually done by a medical doctor, a pediatrician, or a neuropsychologist. And so
But they can.
Pardon?
They do, and they can.
Yeah, they do.
School
They do.
psychologists.
Yeah.
Okay, I've only seen them from my background from the neuropsychologist. But I think when it comes to kids with ADHD, there's 3 really subtypes of that. And so depending on the subtype, when a teacher, and I think Nancy can probably speak to this a little better because she's better with curriculum than me, but I think when you're teaching to an entire class of 30, we know that learning styles are the way kids take in information and process information. And kids with ADHD process differently because of what we call sensory gating. That with ADHD, sensory information competes to be foremost in the brain. And for kids that have ADHD, they really struggle with sensory gating, which is an attention filter in their brain. And so they're not always able to filter out the noise around them to focus on what's being taught. And so I think teachers, they do blend the teaching and learning styles of auditory and visual and tactile, but oftentimes kids with ADHD are told that they're a very tactile learner because they're busy and they're touching, those especially that have the hyperactivity piece. And so I think for teachers, they probably try to teach to all of these. And for even kids without ADHD, they have a different way of learning, with or without ADHD. Nancy, what do you think as far as curriculum and how teachers approach curriculum based learning in the classroom?
And let me intervene for just 1 minute on that, because as you talk about that, and again, I have a son who was, was diagnosed as ADHD, which we had just moved from the area, so it didn't make any difference. But the reality is I had attended a seminar from a psychologist or psychiatrist, I can't remember what his degree was in, and he was talking very much about spatial thinkers and talking about the fact that when you're a spatial thinker, it's exactly what you were talking about, Vikki, where literally you're sitting in class and the bird lands on the window over there and you're aware of that, or somebody drops
Right.
something behind you and you're aware of that. And quite frankly, what happens is that type of situation has to do with spatial thinking, which I've, in the literature recently, I've not found that diagnosis from the standpoint of that perspective. And yet, when we look at the learning capabilities, whether it's visual, auditory, or kinesthetic, that really doesn't approach the fact that they could be one of those three learning styles, and yet they could be spatial in that particular area, which then would create a real issue for them. So, okay, Nancy, now that I've interjected there.
Well, I was going to answer your question about, I think your question was, do we think it's overdiagnosed? Was that your original question?
Right.
I've heard that for many, many years. It's been said for many, many years. I don't know that if you have a professional diagnosis that it's overdiagnosed necessarily. I think getting a second opinion from a neuropsychologist or a pediatrician on the ADHD is a good way to go. And a school psychologist, they have forms for parents and teachers to fill out. And then the forms are quite detailed and you have to check and answer questions. That's how they diagnose it. I mean, I don't know that there's a medical way, like you can diagnose cancer, but I know that on a lot of the neuropsychological assessments, they do have the kids do some tests on the computer to test further. Now, there's a difference, like, for example, my grandson and my daughter, I thought maybe they were ADHD. They just got a lot of energy, but they're very focused. They just got a lot of energy. So that may be, because you're answering questions on a sheet, it may be overdiagnosed. But I know so many kids, and I tutor them myself, that are really ADHD, and I see it, and I've seen that and then some kids, maybe they're just a little hyper and have a lot of energy, or other kids are ADHD inattentive type, where they fall through the cracks because they are quiet, they're not hyperactive, and they're the ones looking at that bird outside and not paying attention to the teacher. They're focusing on, I call it hyper focus. They're focused on everything but the task at hand. So does that answer your question?
Well, it does. It does answer my question. And thank you for that. And again, I'm not suggesting, I mean, the reason I am having you on the show is because I know that there are children out there struggling with ADHD as well as other disabilities, learning disabilities that are a challenge. Let's see if we can't educate the parents a bit who are listening to this today, because let's talk a little bit about cognitive styles, thinking styles, learning styles, because they're all different. So which one of you would care to talk a little bit about the different ways in which we learn, the different ways in which we think?
Vikki is good at that, I would say.
Okay, Vikki.
Okay, well, thinking styles are the way we perceive and take in information. And that's different with all of us based on the way we learn. And learning styles are the way we take what we perceive. Perception is really what we're aware of in our sphere or around us. And then, so it's perception, and then what we take and how we apply that learning skill to hold on to it. Because you have to understand, when kids have problems with sensory gating, a lot of times it's because they're struggling moving it from that short-term memory into long-term memory and attaching retrieval cues. So, they hear something, they're distracted, someone touches them, someone walks by the door, and it takes them a longer time to refocus, and then they've missed information. Now, all kids do that, really. I mean, if you're not attending, you can't move it from short-term memory or working memory into long-term memory. So they can move it into long-term memory sometimes, but then where are those retrieval cues to pull it back out? Some just are better at that than others. And working memory is what we call sticky note memory, where we recall it for a certain amount of time and then we let it go. And so I think oftentimes it comes back to that sensory gating, where that attention filter for kids with ADHD isn't maybe quite as responsive as for those that are real attentive. But Nancy's point was sometimes it is that inattentive or the combined subtype that falls through the cracks. I had sons in both. One was the hyperactive and one was a little bit more inattentive. And, you know, the hyper one gets a lot of attention. It's not always positive attention, but the inattentive just kind of goes into their own little world. And so they're missing out on the learning process too. And, you know, teachers have a difficult job. I mean, they have a class of 30 kids and, you know, they have a lot of things they're trying to accomplish in the time that they have with them. And distractions are real in a closed classroom. They just are, because you've got 30 kids in there and things are going on. So what we try to do, and this is one thing I think is really important with kids that have ADHD, and not all teachers are aware of this, but we really need to focus on what we call process praise, not person praise. And process praise is when we praise the process that they do something. Where person praise, you'd say, oh, you really did a great job writing that paragraph. Well, okay, I did a good job, but like, how did I do a good job? I'm not really sure I know how I did a good job. So that's where we back up and say, hey, let's use process praise and say, you did a great job writing that paragraph. Your opening sentence was clear. It grabbed the attention of the audience. You gave some real concrete background information, and your thesis statement or your claim is excellent. So then the child is able to say, oh, okay, now I understand why I did well, and I will repeat that process. So that also gives you the opportunity with a child that has any kind of ADHD to really other processing disorders as well, to when we speak something, we're using different senses. So we're hearing it and we're speaking it, and that way it kind of moves into that long-term memory so they understand the process of why they did well, not that just, hey, I'm patting myself on the back, I did a good job. Does that help?
Yeah, that helps. And it brings another question to mind. We've got a huge group of kids now that are learning via Zoom.
Yes.
That's just the bottom line. And as we talk about the learning styles, so we're talking about visual, we're talking about kinesthetic, which means you're touching, you're feeling, auditory, where you're listening. They're mainly getting visual. For the most part,
they're on Zoom. Auditory too, actually.
Yeah. Well, I was going to say that they're getting visual with a little bit of auditory, but that auditory is just basically speaking. Okay. It's just like what we're doing here now is just speaking. So for parents, as they see their children struggling a bit, and before they actually get into any type of diagnosis that may be a little bit more intense and needed, how do they deal with their children? And number one, how can they determine if their child is visual, auditory, kinesthetic, or a combination of both? And in the school situation that's going on now, how do they help them if they happen to be not visual and more kinesthetic? How do they help them to be able to learn and to get through what's going on with the teaching via Zoom? Because really I know they're going to be struggling.
What you're referring to, what Vikki and I are referring to when we do one-on-one tutoring, it's quite effective over Zoom because they are listening and seeing. But I think you're referring to a kid who's in a Zoom classroom and they have to just, right, they're listening to the teacher and they have to be on mute and there's not really,
right.
And you have to have an independent child who's good at planning and attending to be good at that. Now, I have found that kids with ADHD actually do quite well over Zoom, some of them, because we're so close and we can talk to each other, and especially if there's a touch screen or we use whiteboards on the screen. But that's why business is so good for me right now, unfortunately. Fortunately and unfortunately, because parents don't know what to do. But I think you can tell your child, I'm a visual learner because I have to take a lot of notes when I listen. Like I don't remember it very well. I mean, there's tests for this. If you get a neuropsychologist to test you, or if you get a full testing into school, they'll be able to tell you what kind of learner your child is, and then you know. You can tell if they're an auditory learner because maybe they'll remember lines from movies really well, or they'll remember jokes, or they'll remember, and they're not so good on paper pencil. That's with my knowledge, that's how I know, if that answers that part of that question. But it is very difficult for parents to have their kids over Zoom. They got to make sure they're in a quiet place where there's not a lot of like I had a tutor over at my house yesterday because it was a snow day and there were too many birds outside. He was distracted. So it wasn't the best room to be in. They've got to be in the right space with the right lighting and quiet and take plenty of breaks.
Yeah, and you bring up a really important point, because you're right, and I think the value of what you're doing, and we can talk about that some more, but the value of what you're doing is you're doing one-on-one
Right.
teaching. And
Yes.
yes, you're right. That's a whole different story, even if
It
it's
is.
via Zoom or whatever, versus being in a quote classroom
Yeah,
of 30 children watching it on a
yeah, and
screen.
teachers have a rough job. Teachers are always connected. They're always getting texts and emails, and they're trying to teach 30 kids, and it's a tough deal. I'm excited for it to be over.
Well, and let's talk about, how does a parent identify that their child, obviously the first thing they know is their kid's struggling. And that's kind of the word they're going to say, my daughter, my son is really struggling. But how do they start to identify what are some of the key diagnostic areas, just as a parent, as they're observing their children, that they can say, okay, you know what, I realize that there's an issue here that I probably need to get some help, some outside help, and some outside diagnostics or whatever.
This is exactly why they need Vikki's book. It's just, she goes through that. So Vikki, tell them how you lead parents.
Well, first of all, having two sons myself go through it, one was a little easier to understand than the other because he did have the hyperactivity piece. And so it was second grade for him, where my other son, it was fourth grade, where things kind of started to unravel for him. But I think that when parents, and most parents are quite hands-on in how they support their children, and there's parent-teacher conferences, but it's just where the scores start to really have a significant difference in what's average and below average and above average, and looking at those scores first of all, and then trying to check into that behavior piece as well, because so often kids that have learning challenges, their self-esteem really starts to decline. And they start showing other kinds of behavioral problems because they're frustrated and they're angry and they resent and they don't understand. And then the parent doesn't really understand either. So I think the first thing, and I just want to point out too, so parents understand, there's difference between a 504 and an IEP. A 504 is where there are certain challenges and disorders that are diagnosed, but all of the accommodations are handled in the classroom. Where a student that has a more significant learning problem, or there's a greater range in differences between average and below average, they might qualify for an IEP, which is an individual education plan. And that's where a lot of accommodations are handled in the classroom, but modifications are handled in what we call a resource room. So in the resource room, the learning is adapted to their level. So if they're in a fifth grade room and they've missed a lot of learning along the way, and they're really at a third grade level in math, they'll go into that resource room, so that continuum can be built in this resource room so that they get back on grade level to move back into the classroom for that particular subject. So that's where we come in. And I just think it's important that parents understand the difference between an IEP and a 504 and modifications and accommodations. Nancy, I can tell you're ready to say
yeah,
something.
just to back you up, where do parents know where to go? So where do they start? So to get to where you're talking about, you start with the standardized test scores, and you maybe see a discrepancy. Then you go to the teacher. What can we do? Then you maybe get that the school can do testing for you. They'll do interventions, they'll watch your child, then they'll do a complete free testing for you in the school to diagnose and see what they need. And or parents can go to a neuropsychologist who will do a complete neuropsychological assessment of your child, which it's a little bit expensive, but it's a great roadmap for the future.
Nancy, wouldn't you say it's a little more involved than the school testing? The neuropsychologist?
It's much more. It is more involved, but there's also good school testing too, or you can go to the pediatrician. So parents, Vikki kind of tells you step by step where to go, because parents don't know what to do. when she was young and had her kids, she didn't know where to go. When I had my kids, I was already working for a neuropsychologist, so I knew what to do, but most parents don't know what to do. So it's how to get started in the school, how to talk to the professionals at the school, how to be an empowered parent, how to help your child have grit,
Look at that
teach them and
plan.
understand.
Well, and really, it seems to me like there's different levels. As I was sharing with you about my son, he was diagnosed, but we found that we were able to, just with a couple of little tricks, help him
Right.
to just get through that. And so, Vikki, as you're talking about it, you're talking about the fact that in class, there are actually some things that the teachers can do to help, and sometimes that takes care of it. And then, as you say, there gets a point in time where if that's not, then they need to go to what you're referring to, a resource room. But here comes an interesting thing, because we talk about bullying, we talk about some of these, self-image and all of those types of things. I've never heard it called a resource room. Guess what I've heard it called? Oh, he's in a special needs class.
Mm.
And the minute that they're using that terminology, all of a sudden you're placing a child's self-confidence and self-esteem in a different situation the minute he's labeled as a special needs child. What are your thoughts on that?
I have some thoughts. I think it's getting better. I think nowadays schools, especially in junior high and high school, they don't remove kids from the classroom. They have a teacher aide in there. So it's called a team taught math class, where they have a resource teacher in there with them. And then they have a study skills class. So it's becoming less of what you're talking about. There has been a stigma, and parents are always worried about getting their kids labeled.
Right.
But you have to have a good team at the school, and there are many good teams. And a lot of times the parents are more worried about it than the child, and that the other kids don't know that they're going to a different classroom, or that they even have a resource teacher helping them. So there can be good and bad. Vikki, what were you thinking about that?
Well, I was just going to say, one of the great accommodations for kids that have ADHD is to be able to take tests in a quiet room, which would be like a resource room. So they don't have all the distractions. And I think you'd be surprised how many kids really do access some of these accommodations and modifications. That's what keeps Nancy and I so busy. And I don't think the stigma is as great as it used to be. And I think once the child sees that the support is helping them, and they're going from D's and C's to A's and B's, and that some of their friends are going, kids are moving a lot of different places during the day. And they're being pulled in and out for different things. And I really don't think it has quite the negative overview as it used to. So many of the kids, and I work with some that have the more challenging deficits, and they seem to do fine with it. I think a lot of it too is how the parents frame it.
Right, I think
How
so.
the school frames it. And I've had parents say to me, will you please come to the school meeting with me, because I don't know what to ask. I don't know what to say. Or I went to a meeting and they said, what accommodations and modifications do you want? And they're like, what? I don't even know what that means. How can I support my child? So it's really a language and a knowledge that the average parent doesn't have. Why would they? I certainly didn't, and Nancy wouldn't have either had she not worked for a neuropsychologist. So that's where we come in to really give the parent that extra confidence and input to make sure that the time spent in that meeting for the 504 IP, the child has exactly what they need. And if they don't, we can go back in and make those changes. I think it just takes a lot of the overwhelmed feeling, and that I don't know how to support my child feeling, away from the parent, because they know they have our support. And schools are different, children are different, teachers are different, and the dynamics are very different. But I just think ADHD is more common, so to speak. I mean, we know it's a brain disorder. We know that a lot of the research is showing that it could be low levels of the dopamine in the brain, which is the reward and motivation, in the neurotransmitter in the brain. So we're understanding more about it, and teachers are learning along the way, and it's just helping us be able to come up with these accommodations and modifications, because these are smart kids. They're not, they're bright kids. And once they figure out how to, or we figure out how to get those modifications and accommodations in place, Nancy and I have seen so many of them really thrive.
Well, and you said exactly the direction I wanted to go with this, because I think so often in the past, anyone that has some type of neurological situation that is being diagnosed as ADHD or whatever that happens to be, sometimes they get labeled as, special needs,
Right.
that type of thing. And my experience, and it's very minimal, let me say this, but my experience is most of the people I know that have had that type of diagnosis are above average intelligence.
Absolutely.
And I think that parents really, it would be so helpful if parents really understood that
Yes.
if their children is struggling, it has nothing to do with their level of intelligence. It just has to do with some neurological issues and learning styles and all of those types of things. Now, Vikki, you talk about the two different types, the IEP and the other thing, but you're going really fast and you're using those letters. And I'd like you to slow down just a little bit and really explain to the parents, because this would be a foundational thing for them. If they're finding that there's some challenges and all of a sudden people are talking about this, what are those two different types of options that their child can have relative to their education?
And this is very well simply laid out in the book. So now Vikki will just slow it down for us.
Yeah.
I'm sorry. It comes so naturally to me.
I know.
Thank you. Absolutely. And Nancy can jump in too. She knows equally as much as I do. A 504 plan, the biggest difference between the IEP and the 504 is the 504, the accommodations are really handled by the teacher in the classroom. So it might be something like having the child with attention deficit sit at the front of the room, not sit by a window. If you sit by a window, or by a door, there's that sensory gating. So it's handling things within the classroom so the teacher's aware of it and things can be managed within the classroom setting.
And the student and parent have responsibilities on that as well.
Yes, they do.
Yes, and that's what I was going to say. So that's where the parent can literally communicate with the teacher can communicate with the parent. They can test different scenarios to see what will help that child to be able to really do what they need to do to learn and to feel comfortable and really be learning and getting the type of responses and grades. And we use grades, and I hate to do that, but we use grades as a measuring tool, but really helping them to do better in school.
And what you were referring to, the labeling, like I have one boy who's afraid to use his times table chart. That's a great 504 accommodation because he can't remember his times tables, but he's embarrassed to pull it out. But it's teaching him to advocate for himself and know that he needs that, and he gets that accommodation, and having kids be comfortable with that, teaching them that there's nothing wrong with them.
Well, and I think that becomes, not only is there nothing wrong with teaching them that, you know what, you're probably more intelligent than a lot of kids around here, but the reality is that you've got this particular issue, but also teaching the children and teaching the general community and population that this has nothing to do with intelligence. This has strictly something to do with the way the neurological pathways are going within the brain and the levels of, as you say, dopamine and some of those other things. All right, so that's the 504, and however they came up with that, I don't know. Had to be a mathematician. So anyway, the IEP. Explain what those letters mean, and who fits into that type of category, and then how do the parents approach that in a way that they're making sure that their children are being taken care of.
It stands for Individualized Educational Plan. And generally kids that fall into that category, there's a greater discrepancy in where their performance is. And so their
IQ might be here and their math might be here. That's what she's meaning.
So that's what I'm thinking, Nancy.
Yeah.
And so they have to qualify for that. So that's just kind of a different level. And each child is very different. And like I say, a lot of those children that have an IEP they aren't performing on grade level, like say in math. And so it's hard to stay in the classroom because if you don't understand third or fourth grade math, how are you going to understand sixth grade math if you're in sixth grade? So
Yeah.
that's where we really start to see, as some of them get older, that the discrepancy is greater and greater, and that they need to be then taught differently so that they can catch up at a slower pace in like what we call a resource room, where we can get them up to grade level so that when they move back into the classroom, if that happens, they're able to just join in with the group and not feel like they're always several steps behind. And so, coming kind of back to that right brain, left brain, that left brain is that real logical thinker, where the right brain is the more creative. And I think too, tapping into the right brain, left brain, and how they learn helps as well. Because when I work with kids individually, if they're really a right brain learner in a lot of ways, pictures and drawings and hands-on and creativity, where if they're a little more left brain and a little more logical, then we move to that approach. So, and I do find that most kids, Nancy, correct me if I'm wrong, but most kids with ADHD also suffer from, or also have, it's kind of suffer, but from executive dysfunction.
Yes,
Where
executive
they have
function.
trouble with maybe planning or organizing or initiating, or they're very impulsive. And so now, I'm not saying if you have ADHD, you have executive dysfunction, but oftentimes we see a correlation between ADHD and executive dysfunction. So we have to address that as well. And that's what Nancy's company is so great at, as helping the kids get organized.
Okay, so define executive dysfunction.
Okay, executive functioning skills are like planning, attention, being able to prioritize, be able to initiate a task, and metacognition, that's how we think. And so if any of those are a little off, so you have a child that has problems with attention, and then they have problems organizing too, that just makes it a little more challenging for them. So some people organize naturally. I do. I'm a very organized person. It didn't appear so earlier today, but I am. And that comes easy for me. But for some kids, trying to organize themselves and organize a paragraph is very difficult. So that's what executive functioning is. And if it's executive dysfunction, then one of those pieces or more than one of those pieces are lacking.
Okay, so with the individual educational program, you can literally say, hey, they're doing great in English, they're doing great in whatever, but their math skills, there's a processing challenge that they're having with math. And so we can put them into a very specific program to help them to learn how to adapt to that, to the point where they are able to actually do well in math because they're learning it from a different perspective. Is that a fair statement and assessment?
I would say, and remember the IEP process, you need a full test, a neuropsychological test, or the school
Right.
psychologist test. The 504 plan's more of a doctor's note. This child has ADHD, or this child has, I was just looking for them in here. The IEP process, so the individualized education plan covers autism, blindness, deafness, emotional disturbance, intellectual disability, speech or language impairment, traumatic brain injury. Whereas a 504 doesn't go quite as deep. I'm trying to find the ones the 504 covers, but it's just more simple classroom accommodations, where the IEP is changing the curriculum a little bit, modifying the curriculum.
Yes. And what you were
Setting
saying there,
goals.
the diagnosis of the kids that you were sharing with that really is truly a very different thing, if they happen to be blind or those types of things. So
Right.
okay.
Actually 13 areas that fall within, and you have to have one of those areas to qualify for the IEP. So it's a little more rigid, I would say, than the 504. Would you agree with me, Nancy?
A little more difficult to qualify for.
A little more rigid. Uh-huh.
Okay.
And different, yeah.
All right. So let's talk about what you guys do. All right. Let's talk about what you do specifically in tutoring and working with these children. And do you have any stories that you could share with the audience to kind of help them to understand that there is help out there for their child if they're experiencing these kind of situations?
Yeah, I'm going to tell one story about a student that came to me this summer, very anxious, very depressed, very unsure of himself, very struggled with reading, writing, and math, no self-confidence. And so we started with remediating his math skills. This was in the summer, teaching him, once again, he's in 7th grade, but how to add and subtract because he'd forgotten how to do that. We actually took him out of math and have a specific math curriculum for that. But then number 2, we got him tested at the school and tested at a neuropsychologist who would understand his learning styles. He happened to be a really good candidate for a medication for an anti-anxiety, antidepressant. But he was not in school at all, and now he's back in school part-time. The medications worked for him. He's learning his math. He's gaining confidence. He's actually doing work on his own. For a while, he had to do it side by side with us, but teaching him that you can do this yourself. Let's take a little bit at a time, do this alone. Now let's go back to school for these 2 periods, working with a research teacher in the school, a team taught class. In the last 6 months, he's just blossomed from one child into another, and the parents were willing to try some different things. So, but also, teach them how to be organized, how to navigate their online programs. We used to do it all in their backpacks. All the kids had these papers and we had to organize their backpacks, which we may go back to someday. But right now it's organizing their online learning programs and planning. Some kids just see a bunch of homework and they just shut down. They don't know how to organize and plan it. So putting it on different pieces of paper, taking it one chunk at a time, doing one assignment at a time, rewarding yourself, come back and do another, and look how good it feels to be finished.
Okay, and you bring up an interesting point because you talked about medication, and as those of us that are familiar with what's happened in the past, there have been a lot of different types of medications used that in some cases are not necessarily the best medications that should have been used. As you and I talked before we got on the show, you shared with me that they have created some new medications now that are not stimulants, that seem to be able to help without those side effects. Could you, without, just generally talk about what's going on with that?
Just generally, people just don't go just to Ritalin. There's so many different types of medications and different ones that are stimulants and aren't stimulants. And sometimes there's ones that are in and out of the bloodstream, like an aspirin, or others that are more long-term. But this is a very personal decision that you and your child and your physician talk about together. And you do, medication trials. And if it doesn't work, it doesn't work. And if it does work, then, use it to your advantage and work with your psychologist and your pediatrician to make sure you're not on it too long or you're on the right dosage.
Okay. Yeah. And so it's not a lifelong situation anymore. So you can get them to where they need to do, because the reality is those neurological pathways can change over a period of time, and suddenly that medication is no longer needed. So if I'm getting the gist of what you guys do, you literally will work with an individual student based on whatever their specific needs are, and help tutor them and help them to get back to a point where they're functioning as they would want to function, and their parents are feeling comfortable that they're now doing well.
Yes, and Vikki can really speak to, she's so good at teaching kids how to have a growth mindset and how to have grit and how to understand the things that they struggle with, but that's okay. They're also good at this, and here's how we're going to make this better. I think you should talk about that, Vikki, because that's what you do so well.
And Vikki, we've got about 5 minutes, so please.
Really quick. One point I did want to make too is that if a family goes the route of a medication, that needs to be handled through a medical doctor, not the neuropsychologist. And it worked really well for both my boys, and they still in their 30s choose to take it. But again, I think it needs to be a very personal decision. And it's also the chemistry of the child too. Some just deal with it better than others, but I think stigma isn't quite what it used to be. So growth mindset, it's a real buzzword right now, and growth mindset versus fixed mindset. And we really work with our kids to have what we call a growth mindset. A fixed mindset is, I can't do it, I'm dumb, this isn't going to work for me, I'm stupid, I hate math, or I hate science. And it's like, well, let's back up. You're not dumb. You're not stupid. You can do it. And you're not perfect today. It's not about being perfect. It's about trying and showing them the small steps that they make. I have so many success stories of kids that started with me that just were shut down and struggling. And it's just, so wonderful to see them come out of their shell and recognize that even though they see themselves as the only person that maybe has a deficit or a weakness, we all have weaknesses. Maybe it's not a diagnosed weakness, but I was never good at math. I mean, I don't know how I got through statistics in my business class, but it's just important to let them know they're not alone, and that a lot of it comes back to that mental mindset. I can do this. It doesn't need to be perfect. Perfect isn't the expectation. And then to really teach kids to self-advocate, to be able to say, this is hard for me, or I need help with this, and to applaud them again for the good things they're doing and give them the support for the things that are a little more challenging. And one of the words I just don't like at all is when they'll say, I'm so dumb. And I'll say, no, you're not. Absolutely, you're not. Look at the growth you've made. Look at how good you are here. Look at the great things you're doing there. So there's a balance in, and to say to them, we all have struggles. Absolutely, all of us. So I think it's important. They don't feel quite as alone. And then as they start to progress, you're looking at that process praise again. Why did you do well? Because you did this, this, and this. And then it helps them say, oh, wow, yeah, I do have ownership here. I can make a difference. I can make this happen. But it comes back to my mental mindset.
Okay, so I'm a parent listening to this and I'm going, I really need some help. If I call you, are you going to help me to navigate through this whole process?
You'll call Nancy, and then she'll call.
Well, okay. All right. Yeah.
Nancy's the top of the pecking order, and then
and I'd refer. But you know what? For most parents, because tutoring gets full. There's a lot of tutoring companies, and there's a lot of companies. There's a lot of people that can help out there. But this is where I'd start if you don't want to spend a lot of money. Just step by step, and this will take you through what you need to try.
And you're holding up the book Building Blocks.
Yes, I am holding up Vikki's book Building Blocks.
Okay.
And just because it's so simple and it's not expensive.
Right. So they can go to your website, which is
www.throught.tutoring.com. And Vikki has written a lot of blog posts on there. There's a lot of good information to get you started there. And then if you want to come and get some academic coaching, you're welcome to sign up.
Well, ladies, this has been most educational, and thank you for taking the time to share your expertise on this. And I think the overall thing that I've gotten out of this, number one, is, guess what, parents? Your kids are not stupid. In fact, more than likely, they have a higher IQ than most.
Yep.
Number two, this is strictly like having, in my case, you've got some decay in a tooth that you just got to repair. And
right.
In this case, it's just a neurological issue that can be repaired, can be changed, and can be modified to where they can produce and be as successful in life as anyone else.
Mm-hmm. And they can strategize so that they can succeed. Mm-hmm.
All right. Well, thank you so much. This has been a great interview. And folks, thanks so much for listening. We hope you enjoyed it, and we'll look forward to having you join us again soon.